Okay, I'm going to call the Spiny Dogfish Board meeting to order. My name is Rob O'Reilly, and first thing I'd like to ask the board, you have a copy of the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? If there are, raise your hand and we'll tackle that. Seeing no changes, by consent, the agenda is approved. Also looking for approval of the proceedings from the October 2017 meeting. Do I see anyone who is in opposition to approving that? The answer is no, so by consent we'll approve the proceedings from October 2017. We'll have public comment. I don't have any slips of anyone who signed up for public comment. Nonetheless, if you have something that's pretty quick and you wanted to talk to the board, now's your opportunity. Is there anyone who wishes to do so? No, there isn't. The next thing we're going to do is Jason Didden is here from the Mid-Atlantic Council, and he's going to review the 2018 stock assessment update. Jason?
Thank you. So I'll dive right into it. Again, an overview of the stock assessment update and then kind of what that has meant for ABC projections and recommendations coming out from the Council's SSC. The last benchmark, so it's been quite a while since we've had a benchmark. We do have a, on the tentative NRCC schedule for another benchmark in 2021. For the recent assessment update, not overfished in 2018, no overfishing in 2017. It's a little unusual that it's 2 different years, but it's just because of how that particular assessment works, and I'll get into that in a bit later. But it is, they do make the determinations on 2 different years with this particular assessment. So again, overfishing not occurring, a bit below the reference point, and not overfished, but only at 67% of the target. So kind of getting down close to that 50% range on biomass. So again, there's a lot of bells and whistles with any assessment, but with the Spiny Dogfish assessment, it's basically coming almost straight out of the spring Northeast Fisheries Science Center survey. That's what drives the bus on this assessment. So you know, it includes information coming out on pups. It includes information about uncertainty and the variance in the survey that it's getting. But I mean, it's really the core thing is what that Science Center spring trawl survey that is the assessment. It's a fairly basic swept area biomass calculation, again, with some bells and whistles. And then there is, that, and we'll get into, as you can see here, so the black line here, those are just the individual survey data points. And you can see those bump around a lot from year to year. So those points, there's a 3-year smoothing that goes on to try to eliminate some of that variability. But I think it's still, kind of an open question about how much of the signal, even with the smoothing, is real trends in biomass and how much is noise. And there has been a variety of research in recent years that there's likely strong availability issues, both in terms of depth of where spiny dogfish are and spatially in terms of the habitat they use and the area that the survey samples. So again, there's a 3-year smoothing that goes on there. You'll see, so you see a couple different different color points right at the end there. The council and the council's SSC explored a couple different ways of smoothing the data, and you can see, and those are just the 2 blue lines. That's basically the standard one coming out of the last benchmark, and that's what's used. That's what the SSC used. They also looked at either excluding that low point in the second to last low point. Also considered looking at a Kalman filter, which is just kind of another slightly fancier smoothing feature that considers some of the variance in each data point. Ultimately, they came back to the basic 3-year, but you can see that depending on exactly how you smooth that data, you get some pretty substantial changes. So again, there's a lot of noise that's being smoothed out here, and how exactly you smooth can affect where you think you are. I think I went backwards there. Okay. So one thing I wanted to flag was kind of where are we now relative to where we thought we'd be. So the dark blue line are just the projections that came out of the last assessment update we had back in 2015. And so that line is where we projected we would be. And then I've got the 95 and 5% confidence intervals on those projections. The big single blue dot, that's our current estimate. So you can see, we're basically fairly close to where we thought we'd be, at least in terms of how the assessment is working. Only a little bit lower than was projected and well within those confidence intervals. Now again, how much of any of this is noise versus true, trends in abundance is open to question, and I think we'll probably get a lot of discussion at the next benchmark, but this is what we have now. Again, that's where we thought we were, that's where we thought we'd be now, and then this is the 2008 estimate in terms of biomass. I forgot about those handy dandy little pop-ups I had. Okay, so that's biomass. The other kind of component is on the fishing mortality side. Again, it's basically looking what percent of the population is caught relative to the overall population, and there's a lot that goes into that. I'm not going to kind of go into all the details, but it's considering the information about growth, about recruitment, and then looking at basically what percent of the stock are you killing. So these are the fishing mortality estimates. Again, the blue line is kind of the basic method of the final terminal smoothing that came out of the last assessment. But again, you can see, depending on exactly how you smooth, your perspective on whether or not you're overfishing or not can change. But what the SSC went with is what came out of the last benchmark. There was a lot of discussion about whether or not to eliminate that low data point, that 2017 low data point. But in recent years, that's actually the only year that the survey ran as it's supposed to run. The year before and the year after, there were a variety of survey performance issues that left late, had to cut a bunch of stations in 2018. So the SSC ultimately said, yeah, it seems low. Given life history, is that what we think Spiny Dogfish is changing? That much biomass? No, but given the low year was actually the only year of the 3 that it ran, that the survey performed in terms of timing and stations normally, they didn't see a reason to just totally jettison it. Pup production, again, is one thing that goes into the projections. You can see the last 4 years have been kind of in the middle, not super high, not super low. So you have the stock status, you've got fishing mortality, and then the projections are going forward. You're starting at one place, you've got a certain amount of fish coming in, certain amount of fish going out, lots of details, kind of typical things. It's looking at, the growth is sex-specific, fishing mortality is sex-specific. The reproduction scales with the biomass. You have more biomass, more reproduction. Again, so it's not just fish in, fish out, but that's basically what they're trying to figure out here. It's all by length, so again, we can kind of dive back into some of these details later, but again, basically the projections are making certain assumptions about growth, about recruitment, to try to determine, starting at place A, fish in, fish out. And so this is using the standard 3-year averaging, and the Council's risk policy advises the SSC on how to do these really what kind of projections to use. So I have a quick kind of primer on the risk policy. So one thing is really simple. If you have a lower stock size, you're taking a certain percentage of that out, catch is going to be lower. But the council also says when stock size is lower, we want a lower probability of overfishing. So there's kind of a bit of a synergistic effect there, and I kind of liken it to imagine you're entering a school zone with that flashing yellow light. You're going to slow down for two reasons. One, the speed limit is just lower. That's like the stock size is lower. But I'm also going to slow down because there's a risk element. At least in Dover, Delaware, they really like to have speed traps in those zones. And so I cut back partially because it's gone from 35 to 25, but I also cut back partially because the risk of getting a ticket in that area is higher. So there's kind of a synergistic between A, just the stock size, and B, the council's risk of overfishing changes with the lower stock size. So then there's a third component. That's what our risk is, but that's also informed by our sense of uncertainty. And the council has basically said to the SSC, look at the uncertainty that comes out of the assessment and make a judgment call. Does the CV, is the assessment accurate? And that's the CV, coefficient of variation, is that low or high? So the way I kind of think of it is if you had a real accurate speedometer on a car or an assessment, that's like a low CV. So I'm driving this car, and let's say a speeding ticket is overfishing. Let's say the speed limit's 55. On that car, if the speedometer says 60, I think probably a really low chance of getting a ticket. Now, let's say you have a really inaccurate speedometer, which is like an inaccurate assessment. Let's say you're driving this. Same situation. Yeah, maybe you can't go 60, but that's another question. So, if the speedometer on this car says 60, I'm probably not real certain of my real speed. So I'm going to slow down maybe a bit more if I really want to avoid a ticket. And so the SSC also kind of imposes what its sense of uncertainty on that. And if the SSC puts higher uncertainty, the calculations dial back. So you kind of have three things that really drive these projections. What is the stock size? Has it gotten low enough that the council says we want to be less risky? And then, given the uncertainty and our desire to avoid that risk of overfishing, more uncertainty, we have to cut back even more. So there's a couple things. So stock size is below the target. Typically, the council wants 40% probability overfishing, but since we're below the target, those are the probabilities, around 26, 27, 20, 30%. As the stock size starts to increase, the council says a little higher probability of overfishing is okay. The SSC bumped the CV up to 100%, and so that kind of, in order to achieve those probabilities of overfishing, it lowers the projections. So these are what they are. When you run it through the model, you use that risk policy, that sense of uncertainty. These are the ABCs, total catches that both staff recommended and the SSC recommended and the council used. So when you run those through the projection model, you can see that the stock slowly increases over the time of the specs. And I just have a few things, again, so that assignment of uncertainty is important. It's part of what drives things. Just highlighting a few of the things that the SSC noted. A, those big jumps in the survey are unlikely to be representative of what's really occurring. Some kind of availability is it changes at work. There's uncertainty in the size structure, concerns about how selectivity may change in the fishery between the sexes, concern about uncertainty and survival of dogfish that are discarded, just the general uncertainty in the biomass and the pup abundance estimates. And again, you saw those four different colors, depending on how you smooth things, it changes your answer a lot. The fact that small changes in how you're going to do some smoothing at the end has such a big influence on where you are, that indicates you have a fair bit of uncertainty. We're just using one survey. NEMAP isn't in there, and that's it for me. I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. We'll have a few questions, but I wanted to ask you, Jason, you mentioned the benchmark, and I talked to you a little before the meeting. That's scheduled for 2021, is my understanding.
Yep.
Okay, and the other idea is you had the fishing mortality rate graph up there, but the 2017 fishing mortality rate was about 0.21. It was not adjusted with common, and 2017 was kept in. Is that correct?
Yeah, with, so the fishing mortality rate estimate for 2017, yeah, was 0.2.
Questions for Jason? David Pierce?
Yeah, Jason, you and I have had a back and forth conversation about the status of the stock and what the SSC did. Could you put the figure back up that shows SSB over time and, of course, the lines connecting all the years? I just need to clarify one particular point since, go ahead, that right there, right. Okay, now the value of female spawning stock biomass that was used in the 3-year moving average, 2016, 17, and 18, that's not the blue dot, right? That would be the one that's lowest on the graph, black line?
So the black line are the actual annual estimates. There are two blue lines. The open circles are the swept area SSB, and then the light blue triangles that's with the dotted line, the blue triangles are the 3-year moving average, and the closed blue circles are the stochastic SSB estimates. Again, it's basically the 3-year average with some bells and whistles. So black is the year-to-year, the blues are the SSB estimates.
Okay, so the 3-year moving average included the historically low 2017 estimate. All right, it's historically low, as it was back in the 1990s, that led to a decision by the Mid-Atlantic Council to basically stop all landing of dogfish, and then that decision was revised. So can you again help us understand, help me understand, why, in light of the fact that we're not overfished, overfishing is not occurring, biomass is still on the high side, why was that year, 2017, used, especially when it indicated that we dropped from 175,000 metric tons down to 25,000 metric tons in 1 year, and that's impossible. I recognize there's uncertainty. Nevertheless, you know, why use it and not throw it out?
I mean, I guess you could always flip the question of, given that was the only year where the survey ran kind of properly, why would you not keep it? I think, you know, I had substantial discussions with the Science Center on the same question. The Science Center, I think, did kind of an extra dive into the data to kind of see, is there anything about, you know, the performance of the survey that would suggest, you know, there's some issue besides it being low to throw it out. And I think the SSC said, just because it's low, there would have to be some other reason to discard it other than it just being low. And I mean, my general sense is, you know, I don't, given how, especially given some of the papers that have come out on availability and distribution, you know, I think the ramp up from 2005 to, you know, 2012 is, and then the drop down from 12 to now, both are probably artifacts of availability. I did do, you know, one kind of personal analysis, and it's in one of my supporting slides here. Could you flip like all the, it's almost towards the end.
You got it.
You know what slide?
Yeah, you're right there. Yep. I see it.
Yeah.
You got it. Yep.
So on this, it's really simple. I just graphed discards of female dogfish on trawl trips. What's the average amount of female dog greater than 8 centimeters discarded on your average trawl trip. So, you know, you've got thousands of trawl trips, you have however many hundreds of trips get observed, and, you know, and so I've kind of plotted on here, the blue is the survey estimates, the orange there is my kind of personal index of metric tons of female discards per trawl trip. You know, I suspect this is more what's going on. Since fishery management started in the 2000s, we've kind of had a slow and steady increase. That's kind of what you would expect with the biology of spiny dogfish, and I don't know, hopefully the next the benchmark, we kind of dive into some of those availability issues, and you know, if we get, you know, some more information on how that availability may be driving things, and maybe at that point, you know, folks decide to kill that 2017 data point, but I think folks were hesitant to kill it just because it was low without any other rationale.
Yeah, thank you. One more question, Mr. Chairman.
Right ahead.
Yeah, this historically low data point will likely be used in the 3-year moving average as we move into the future, which is why I raised this question. Now, back when the dogfish resource was in very sad shape, back in the 1990s, late 1990s, because fishermen were convinced and encouraged to remove the dogfish because they compete with gaddids. When dogfish are up, the cod and other gaddids are down. Back then, we were told that the average size of the females, mature females, was going down, and we were told that the average size of the pups was going down, and we were told that the number of pups was very, very low, and you showed that on a previous graph. Did the SSC consider, as part of their evaluation of where the numbers should be, the fact that, according to the assessment, the average size of females is still inclining upwards. The average size of pups is still, you know, going up, and the number of pups is still, you know, modest, not the way it was, although I still have problems with the pup index. Anyways, that's all positive sign. So, did that factor into any of the discussion about, you know, the use, for example, of that 2017 figure?
It's certainly factored into their general discussion. I had thrown this up for them also, which again, as you said, shows that kind of slow increase since management started in the size of mature female spiny dogfish. You know, I think, you know, they were also considering going with some of the methods that would have resulted in a more drastic reduction. And I think some of these other kind of slow and steady increases that they saw were, you know, probably part of the reason why they went with what they did and not even something potentially substantially lower. But they did look at it.
Other questions for Jason? Okay, seeing none, we're going to move forward. You probably know that we have about an hour altogether, so Kirby Roots-Murdy will make a presentation now concerning the adjustments to the federal commercial trip limit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just getting my presentation up. So we structured this to have the board consider if they want to make any recommendations on the federal trip limit before making specification or setting specification. So I just ask that you kind of keep in mind the presentation Jason gave you. It'll come back when we get to the actual 2019 to 2021 specifications. But with that said, I'll go through my presentation now. So just an outline, I'm going to give a little bit of background. Some of the recent management actions that the Mid-Atlantic Council and the New England Council took over the last month and a half, and then talk about considerations as you move into what you want to consider and put in place for 2019 through 2021 specifications, and then we can talk about next steps. So in terms of the federal trip limit, there's a federal specification process, as you all are aware, that specifies what the commercial quota will be, as well as any recommendation of additional measures. So the federal trip limit has become one of those things that is annually specified by the Mid-Atlantic Council and New England Fishery Management Council. So as you all know, they have a joint management plan, and they can do multi-year specifications under that. I bring up this point that there's a number of measures that they can recommend, but the federal trip limit is not actually a component that says that they have to, by the provisions of the FMP, the federal FMP, set one every year. It's become kind of a norm that's in place. So leaving that aside, on our end, on the commission side, the state specification process kind of mirrors somewhat the federal FMP, as we have a complementary plan to it, and that the board sets commercial quotas and trip limits for the northern region. So that was established through the Commission's FMP back in 2002. Multi-year specifications was set aside or established through Addendum 2, and then the northern region trip limit, which is what this board will have to specify later on in this meeting, that was outlined in Addendum 3. New York through North Carolina set their own trip limits based on the quota they have. So this board does not set that up annually or on a multi-year basis. It's left up to the states to manage the quota as best they see needed. So as you probably saw, we had in the briefing materials a letter that was sent to both this board and the Mid-Atlantic Council discussing the possibility of not setting a federal trip limit. In discussing that concept with Council, Mid-Atlantic Council staff, GARFO staff, and New England Fishery Management Council staff, doing so, that is just not setting a federal trip limit, would likely require a framework or an amendment to the federal FMP. And the reason why is that that change would be a significant change in terms of the annual process. Depending on what kind of change it is, whether it's setting a much higher trip limit or something different from a set per trip poundage, it may require either an amendment, which would be more significant, or it could be done through a framework. So I also include here what the federal trip limits have been over time. So as you can see, from 2007 to through 2012, it was set at 3,000 pounds, and then over the years, it's kind of ramped up a bit, up to where we are now, where the 2016 to 2018 specifications had it set at 6,000 pounds. So in terms of recent action, as I mentioned, we have the letter that David Borden wrote to the board and Mid-Atlantic Council. The New England Fishery Management Council recommended that the MID increase the federal trip limit to 8,000 pounds and that an action be considered removing it altogether. Earlier this month, the Mid-Atlantic Council, in turn, decided to recommend that the federal trip limit be set at 6,000 pounds for the next specification process. So for the next 3 years, it'd be set at 6,000 pounds. The Mid-Atlantic Council also made a motion to address the federal trip limit through action, which would include either potentially removing it by adding it to their list of priorities for the 2019 year. So in doing so, it could be something that would be addressed by staff working with us and GARFO to determine whether a framework or amendment is needed. But that will be up for the Mid-Atlantic Council to consider in December. For your guys' considerations today, the board could have a discussion on whether to make any recommendations for setting the federal trip limit at a different level than 6,000 pounds. Again, that would just be a recommendation. The board does not annually have to do that. Rather, the board is just going to set the specifications for stay waters, and in particular the trip limit for that northern region of Maine through Connecticut. As I said, in December, the New England Fishery Management Council will actually make their recommendation to NOAA on what the federal trip limit should be, and it should be clear that if there's a disagreement between what the Mid-Atlantic Council put forward in their recommendation to NOAA Fisheries and what the New England Council puts forward in their recommendation, then NOAA Fisheries can pretty much set the federal trip limit at anything that was not rejected by both councils. And again, the Mid-Atlantic Council will set their work priorities in 2019 in December. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Eric Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kirby, I'm pretty sure that the New England's action was up to 8,000 pounds, not 8,000 pounds. So it was some number between 0 and 8,000.
Thank you, Eric. That's correct. That's an important distinction.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
David Pierce?
Kirby, you gave a very good summary of background material. I need you to refresh my memory if you can. I believe that the reason for there being no trip limits, federal limits from New York to the south, was that there was an expectation that the processors or some processors would actually come into play, that there would be processing capacity in the mid-Atlantic. Because at that time and now, the processors are in Massachusetts. That's where the processors are, in Massachusetts. So am I right with that background statement, that there was an expectation that there would be processors in the mid-Atlantic to take advantage of all the dogfish that would be coming in with no limits?
So, David, I would actually defer to you on that. I have not worked on this plan long enough to know for sure. But just to clarify, the federal trip limit applies to federal waters. So it goes up and down the coast. The states of North Carolina through New York, they set their trip limit for state waters. So what that means is if you have federally permitted fishermen going out and fishing, they're held to whatever the more restrictive measure is. So in turn, if the state trip limit is higher and they have a federal permit, then they have to abide by the federal trip limit.
David, I think that was one of the ideas. I can't remember that was really a driving force on having the processors in the Mid-Atlantic, but there certainly was talk at the time of developing that, and as you know, that didn't develop. But I mean, we could look back and make certain as to what was the driving force.
Just to add, when our advisory panel meets, we get kind of a wide range on input, everything from no trip limits for a North Carolina reduction fishery to lower the trip limits to make sure, from where they are now, to make sure that there aren't closures. To, again, some of the Rhode Island stuff, maybe some shipping would be easier with certain things. New York would like maybe some kind of bi-monthly trip limit. And since there are differential impacts on the regions of changing that federal trip limit, I think was one of the reasons why the council thought shift that discussion to a framework when the public kind of would have more warning, more opportunity to participate and kind of express those concerns.
Any other questions? Eric Reed?
Yeah, thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Just to David Pierce's point to his question, the ability to take advantages of economies of scale is really what, the way I understand it, drove the southern trip limit. Dogfish is a relatively inexpensive protein, and if your trip limit is 4,000 pounds, for example, pick a number, any number, to fill a truck, it takes you several trips or several days, however you want to look at it. The processors currently are all in New Bedford. There was one at one time in Virginia, but it burnt down many years ago. I'm not sure if the fire is out yet or not, but it burnt down some time ago. So that was the driving factor. It's the pure economics of an inexpensive protein and getting it to where it actually can be processed and being able to take advantage of a pretty substantial economy of scale.
Thank you, Eric. Anyone else on the federal trip limit issue? So if not, we're going to move towards some action items that will require some motions, and Kirby will be first.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll go through the 2019 through 2021 fishery specifications for spiny dogfish. Just an overview. I'm going to give some background, the advisory panel report, some landings update, and then those specifications that were approved by the Mid-Atlantic Council. So as I walked through in the previous presentation, it's a jointly managed plan between the Mid-Atlantic Council and the New England Fishery Management Council. The board, the commission has a complementary plan to that joint plan. We are in the last year, the ending year of a 3-year specification cycle. So what's before the board today will be setting specifications for 2019 through up to 2021. So the advisory panel met back in, I believe it was September, and some of the big things that came up that's not uncommon on the advisory panel reports is that market and that demand is really driving the fishery in terms of the catch. There's currently a weak market demand, and in turn that's why when we get to the landings you'll see that they're not tracking quite as closely with the quota in terms of possibly hitting the quota by the end of the year. As Jason noted, that the other thing that came up during the AP call was whether abundance is truly being measured by the survey or not, and that applies also to catch. Boats have, we were hearing from AP members, have no problem catching their trip limit. It's just a matter of whether it's worth their while to go out and catch them. Issues were raised by AP members regarding the data from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center's trawl survey, as well as the stock assessment in terms of the overall stock size. They expressed concern that the survey and the assessment don't really reflect what they're seeing on the water. And in terms of looking at how the federal trip limit or state trip limits should change over time, many cautioned that it'd be best that there was a more slow and steady approach if there's an interest in changing them, either increasing them or moving to some kind of more broader weekly limit. So this slide here just is trying to show you guys how landings have tracked with the quota over the years. So pretty much from 2011 onward, there's kind of been a big divergence between what the quota is and where landings have kind of landed at the end of the year. So as you can see, the gap probably was most pronounced in 2015, 2016. As the quota there was a big drop-off in 2016 in the last specification process. It's about a 30% reduction from the previous year. And as you can see, landings have also kind of tracked downward, but there's been, as you can see, quite a bit of a gap between where those two are. In looking at the landings report through October 17, you can see here that we have, if you were to equally parse out the landings through the end of the year to hit the quota, that's the green line. The orange line shows you where the overall track of landings were for the previous year, and the blue line here shows you where we're at relative to those kind of two. So you can see that for this year so far, we're actually tracking well below where we were last year and likely well below hitting the quota for the 2018-2019 season. This is what the breakdown is at the state-by-state and regional level in terms of landings through this point. So as you can see, the big number to keep in mind at the bottom right is that we're at about 21% of the overall coastwide quota. So Jason noted the recommendations from the Mid-Atlantic Council. They applied their risk policy, and the ABC was calculated using 100% CV. I think Jason's analogy, was very helpful. Hopefully you guys better understand how a CV is set and what it means for setting the acceptable biological catch. The monitoring committee didn't recommend any changes to the ABC or quota from the SSC, and they also didn't specify any management uncertainty. So as we noted, the Mid-Atlantic Council approved the commercial quota as derived from the SSC's recommended acceptable biological catch. This table here shows you what that breakdown is from the OFL, the overfishing limit, down to the ABC, all the way down to what the commercial quota is. So for 2019, what that results in is a quota starting at 20.5 million pounds. That's about a 46% reduction from the 2018 quota, which is at 38 million pounds. For 2020 and then 2021, it ramps back up, increasing to 23.1 and then 27.4 million pounds. So in summary, as the AP noted, catch is driven by markets and price. The assessment update shows a decline in 2017, a slight increase in 2018, but not enough to overcome that, and therefore we're dealing with a much lower quota. And as it was noted in the assessment and by AP members, there's concerns about whether the survey is tracking abundance or availability. Landings through the first half of the year, as I said, are about 21% of the quota, and the mid-approved harvest specifications for 2019 through 21 and recommended the federal triple limit be at 6,000 pounds. And as I noted, it's about a 46% decrease from our current year's commercial quota. So for next steps, this board needs to set the commercial quota as well as set the northern region trip limit in state waters. With that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Questions for Kirby? Seeing none, I think we have some motions prepared. If we could do the coastwide quota first, that would be good, and we'll get someone to make that motion and second it.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Maureen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the Spiny Dogfish quota for 2019 through 2020 be set at 20,522,832 million pounds. 2020 to 2021 be set at 23,194,835 million pounds. 2021-2022 be set at 27,421,096 million pounds.
Thank you. Is there a second to that motion? David Borden. Discussion on the motion. David Pierce and then David Borden.
Yeah, I recognize that landings have been down far lower than what the quota has been, and I recognize the fact that indeed market demand has, price to fishermen, price to processors, market demand has been very instrumental in causing that shortfall, that is catch not equaling or approaching the quota that's been available. And I appreciate all of that because of a paper that was prepared by my agency, by the Division of Marine Fisheries. Actually, we asked for this paper to be produced, and it was prepared by some contractors. This was done on behalf of our seafood marketing program, the steering committee. The copies are on the table, and I hope that as this board progresses and continues this discussion about quotas down the road and about trip limits, that this economic analysis be appreciated. Some good work was done by the contractors to highlight the economic problems that the industry faces regarding taking full advantage of the quotas that are available. Now, I'm not going to support the motion for one reason only, and I've made it clear that I do not believe that that 2017 data point should have been used. It's historically low. It should have been discarded. I recognize why the SSC did not discard it, why they included it. But it has life. That historical low data point has life. It will be used in the next year's 3-year moving average, and then it impacts these numbers. It creates these numbers. So just on a matter of principle and my understanding of how these assessments are done, I'm not going to support the motion.
Thank you, David. David Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I similarly have qualms about the 2017 data point, but where I really see this sitting is that we have a couple of choices. We either accept it, we reject it, we remand it back to the Mid-Atlantic Council and request them to have the SSC revisit it for reasons that have not been entered into the record today. So as far as I'm concerned, this is really the only option we have. Thank you.
Roy Miller.
Mr. Chairman, the motion itself should be adjusted. The word million should be removed 3 times it appears. Thanks.
Thank you, Roy. That will be done. Any other comments? Tom Foti?
I have to say this, I'm in agreement with Dave Pierce for about the same reasons. I also realize that if the projections would have showed that dramatic increase instead of reduction, we would basically have been told, well, we don't have any confidence in the numbers, and we wouldn't have got the increase. And that's what always upsets me on this, and I'm not about to support outliers to basically make decisions that are drastic. So I'm on the line with Dave.
Thank you, Tom. Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions. One is, I don't recall the numbers from one of the previous slides, but I'm wondering what these quota numbers are relative to what the catch has been for the past couple of years. You know, what's the difference between these quota numbers and what the catch was the last couple of years? That's the first question, and then I have a second question.
Jason, do you have those numbers? I think it's 18 million currently, around there, but I think 2016 was 24 million, but Jason may have the hard data.
Yeah, so I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but what we do have, I think for you to help kind of get a visual sense of it, is the on my slide 5 on my presentation, you can see where it's tracked between 20 and 30 million pounds, and so it's kind of bounced around that, and then in 2017, as you can see, it was below it at about 17 million pounds, I think is what we were saying for 2017.
Emerson, another question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. My second question is, and maybe I missed it because I was partially distracted here doing something else. If we're not overfished and overfishing is not occurring, why is there a need for the significant reduction in quota? Without going, with Jason, without having to go through your whole presentation again about uncertainty and so forth.
Jason?
Yeah, I think just at the catches that we've observed, overfishing has not occurred, but if catches had been much higher along the kind of what the maximum quota could have been, I think you probably would have gotten into that overfishing realm. So it's basically to keep it from overfishing, and also it's only at 63 or 60-some% of the target. So in order to let it build back up to 100% of the target, it's a combination of those two things really driving the, again, not reducing landings, but reducing the quota.
Any final comment before we caucus? Go ahead, let's have a 1-minute caucus, and then we'll take a vote on the next 3 years of quota specs. Everyone have enough time? I'm going to read the motion into the record, and then we'll take the vote. Move that the Spiny Dogfish quota for 2019 to 2020 be set at 20,522,832 pounds, that the 2020 to 2021 Spiny Dogfish quota be set at 23,194,835 pounds, and also for the 2021-2022 season, the Spiny Dogfish quota be set at 27,421,096 pounds. So all those who are in favor of the motion, please raise your hand, and we'll try and count you. 11. Opposed, like sign. All opposed, like sign. I'll say by. Abstentions. Null votes. (11,001) null. Motion carries. Next thing is to have a motion concerning the northern region, and I think that's already been prepared as well. Okay, we'll need someone to make that motion, apparently, on the trip limit for the northern region. We don't have a canned motion.
We should have someone
Mr.
say the
Chairman?
motion and then put it up.
Someone needs to say the motion, David Borden.
Well, I don't have a motion, but did the staff prepare a draft motion on this? If they could put it up on the board, that'd be helpful.
I think we're having dueling ideas here on that.
It needs to be specified what you want.
David Pierce.
I'll
David
make that
Borden
as a
still has
motion
fun.
with a 6,000-pound trip limit.
Okay, thank you, David. And David Pierce, second. Okay. Okay.
Is there final action?
So we'll have a roll call vote on this.
Unless there's no objection.
Yeah, okay. So when the motion's up there, I'll read it, and then I'll first ask if there's any objection to the motion. Motion is moved to establish a 6,000-pound trip limit for the 2019-2021 fishing seasons for the northern region, Maine through Connecticut. Is there any opposition to that motion? Seeing no opposition, the motion passes. Thank you. Not quite done. Tina Berger is going to give us information concerning there are 4 nominees to the advisory panel. So Tina's joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I offer for your consideration and approval 4 nominees to the Spiny Dogfish AP. They are Thomas Lyons, a commercial gill netter from New Hampshire, Doug Feeney, a commercial hook and line and gill netter from Massachusetts, John Whiteside, a commercial industry attorney, also from Massachusetts, and Scott McDonald, a processor from Virginia.
Any questions or comments from the board concerning the nominees? Okay. Would one or more of you, okay, Richie White?
Move to approve the slate of nominees as presented by Tina.
Is there a second? Okay, second from Ray. Any other comments or discussion on the 4 nominees? I'm going to read this into the record. Move to approve the nomination of Thomas Lyons, New Hampshire, Doug Feeney, Massachusetts, John Whiteside, Massachusetts, and Scott McDonald, Virginia, to the Spiny Dogfish Advisory Panel. And is there any opposition to this motion? Seeing no opposition, we have some new advisory panel members. Thank you, everyone. If you're following along, we're on number 8 in the agenda. So what we need now is a recommendation. There is no current vice chair, and looking for someone to make that recommendation. Mike Louisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to nominate Chris Batsavage to serve as vice chair to the Spiny Dogfish Board.
Thank you, Mike. Is there a second? Second from Ray.
Chris would be taking over as soon as the 2017 data point falls out of the 3-year average. So good luck, Chris.
That works for me. Thanks, Mike.
Are there any other nominations? Nomination is closed, and by acclamation, we welcome Chris Bat-Savage to the 2017 data point. Okay. I understand we have a little bit of other business. David Borden?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Basically, I had submitted a letter to the board, to Rob, in the Mid-Atlantic Council during the monitoring discussions, and I'll just give you a quick background and keep this fairly short. The request was to have the process basically review the pros and cons of eliminating federal trip limit. And I would note, while I'm on this, the discussion by Jason and the Mid-Atlantic advisors, I've listened to that and reviewed the documents for a number of years. It's a really useful piece of input in terms of what the advisors recommend. And so this year I listened to that discussion. At the end of the discussion, I basically made the suggestion and submitted the letter regarding the removal of the federal trip limit. And there are some common themes that run through those advisory comments, and I'll make these really brief. Not harvesting the quota. The discard rates are extremely high, as the staff noted. Some of which is caused by the federal trip limit, so the regulatory discards. There's a lack of flexibility on the part of particularly the northern states to kind of address their particular situation. Eric Reed commented on the issue of economy of scale. Peter Kendall in New Hampshire made almost identical comments at the New England Council meeting. And the general conclusion, my conclusion from listening to the comments is this one-size rule fits all doesn't necessarily work the way we intend it to work. As both Jason and Kirby noted, we manage these two fisheries differently. The Mid-Atlantic Council has a quota system, and then the freedom within state waters to adopt their own trip limits. The New England Council has a regional quota and a standardized federal trip limit. But as soon as the Mid-Atlantic boats and the fishery move into federal waters, then they have to adhere to the federal trip limit. Since we're not achieving the quotas in these areas, that makes little sense to me. So I asked myself, why do we need a federal trip limit? And my conclusion from all of that was we ought to have a discussion about eliminating the trip limit. So the Mid-Atlantic Council and New England Council both have taken the position that they want to examine the pros and cons of this strategy. And I think the Mid-Atlantic Council, and Jason, correct me if I misspeak, basically concluded that might be a priority that they would set in December, but we won't know until December. Yes. So I think there are two questions for the board. You've got two councils that are kind of pursuing that. National Marine Fisheries Service voted in favor of the strategy when it came up at the council meetings. I was in the audience, and I think the votes on the part of the states that are represented around this table was almost unanimous if you looked at the individual votes. So the first question is to the group, do we want to participate in that discussion? And my answer is yes. I think it's useful to do that. And then I think if we get a consensus on that point, then I can suggest a course of action that we could follow, which would kind of simplify it. So I guess my question to you, Mr. Chairman, is to the board, do we want to consider the pros and cons of eliminating the trip limit? I can make a motion, but I don't think it's necessary.
Thank you, David. So what I didn't mention earlier, there has not been a Spiny Dogfish board meeting since last year. But in the meantime, there were 2 working group meetings that were held, Raymond Kane and David Borden, Adam Nowalski, Doug Grout, myself, Jason Didden, representative from New England Council, representative from NIMS, and they were conference calls, but perhaps that's the way to start this and get the pros and cons that way, David. So that'd be my suggestion. David?
You know, that would be fine with, well, let me just make a process suggestion. If the board's willing to do this, then I think we've got the time. I'm not asking the board to take any action at this point. In other words, and by that I'll be explicit, and I'm not asking the board to start an addendum. I'm saying just carry on a dialogue on this issue and flesh it out some more. We have the advantage of, there's a New England Council meeting in December. There's also a Mid-Atlantic Council meeting in December. If we had, for instance, a conference call, as you suggest, between now and then, it might be useful to have a conference call that involved the Mid-Atlantic states because they have a different factual basis for making any determination on that, and a conference call that would involve the New England states. And then possibly we could discuss it in conjunction with those meetings that are already scheduled, and then bring some kind of recommendation back to the board.
David Pierce?
Yeah, I agree with David Borden. The discussion should continue, and now that discussion can be informed by the analysis that I referenced earlier on, the economic analysis of spiny dogfish, historical trends, future markets, and implications for management action. This particular analysis was not made available to the Mid-Atlantic Council for its consideration. It was made available to the Executive Director of the New England Council, and it was not distributed to the New England Council members for their consideration. So it's now out there. It can be used along with whatever else to, again, inform discussion following the procedure that David suggested.
So David Borden, I think we'll just talk a little bit more and figure out how to get those conferences going.
Yeah. Would you like a motion? Would it simplify this? If
I think the whole board should say that this is a good idea.
Okay, so I'll make a motion and we move that the Dogfish Board explore the pros and cons associated with removing the federal trip limit with an intent to report to the board at the winter meeting.
Seconded by Richie White. Discussion on the motion that you can't see, but I hope you heard it. It all involves this push about moving away the federal limit, the trip limit. Any comments? Since it started out really as a straw process by David Borden to get something going here, I think it's probably enough just to ask you if you have any opposition to what you heard, that we move forward with this. If there's no opposition, that sounds great. Thank you very much. Mike Louisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, in putting on my council chair hat at the Mid, as has been mentioned during the presentations earlier, the executive committee of the Mid-Atlantic Council added this consideration of a potential change or removal of the federal trip limit to their draft 2019 priorities, which will be discussed in December and finalized. The way I'm trying to figure out how this board can strengthen that suggestion that the Mid-Atlantic Council leave that bullet in their 2019 priorities. Like I said, it's a draft right now. the priorities will be discussed by the full council in December, and by the passing of this motion, you know, I'm looking at it as an intent to explore that concept of changes and/or removal, perhaps, of the federal trip limit. So, Mr. Chairman, I don't know if that message could come from you at the time when we're having this discussion at the council, or do you think there might need to be more of a formal statement from the board to the Mid-Atlantic Council to continue to, well, to leave this issue in their 2019 priorities for consideration at a future date?
I certainly don't mind doing that, but it would be better to have the board behind that if we had a letter to go along with that. So, you know, that'd be the way to do that. Is that okay, Bob?
Yeah, I think a letter would be, you know, more would carry the full intent of the board. You know, the one option could be to just add a second sentence to this and say, you know, the board requests that a letter be sent to the Mid-Atlantic Council requesting that, you know, the trip limit issue be a priority for their 2019 action plan.
Dave, is that okay with you? Richie? Okay, thank you. Okay, well, good discussion, and I would love to have a motion to adjourn.
Well, they got to vote on this.
Oh, Kirby's reining me in.
They got to vote on this.
Okay, we have to vote on this. We
If
did.
there's no objection, we're fine.
Yeah, we did do a no objection, but we'll do it again if you'd like. Can we do a no objection? Any objection to the motion on the board? Okay, that sounds like before. Thank you very much. And we're not going anywhere yet. Jason has a second idea here for you.
Just a small technical thing. The Massachusetts report was provided to the Mid-Atlantic SSCs and the Mid-Atlantic Council in briefing materials during their deliberations. That's all. Just clarification.
Thank you, Jason. We are adjourned. Thank you.
We'll start the straight pass board at 2:45 on time.